Good afternoon, everyone. It is Tuesday, February the 11th, 2020. It is currently 1:54 p.m. Central Time. Let me start with reading something to you because we were using this really all this week. And this will make sense. If you've been following along this week, you're going to know where I'm going. If not, I think this is the proper way to introduce this special live broadcast of the Theology Central podcast. Are you ready? Listen carefully. Have you ever struggled with some of the things you find in the Bible? There are situations in Scripture that are hard to comprehend in today's context. The book of Ezra contains a perfect example of a difficult passage that can sound cruel and unchristlike to us. In Ezra chapter 10, Ezra prayed about cross-culture marriages and instructed the men to get rid of their wives and children. Why? This week, we're back to basics as the Discover the Word team explores the question, how do we read what we don't understand in the Old Testament? Let me read that question again. How do we read what we don't understand in the Old Testament? All right. That is the way the Discover the Word podcast introduced their series that they're doing this week. And the series they're doing this week is all about understanding Ezra chapter 10 and trying to answer this question, how do we read what we don't understand in the Old Testament? Now, this is what we're doing. Discover the Word. They're looking at Ezra chapter 10. They're trying to answer this question, how do we read what we don't understand in the Old Testament? That's what they're doing. And what we're doing is kind of borrowing what they are doing, but advancing it, adding to the discussion, giving you things to think about, challenging you and how to read the Scriptures and trying to equip you so that you know how to handle difficult passages of Scripture. So we kind of trying to accomplish the same thing, maybe in a little different way. This is what we've done so far. On Sunday at Victory Baptist Church, I preached, it was like 1 hour and 8 minutes. It was during the Sunday school hour. I taught a 1 hour and probably 8 minute long lesson called Understanding Difficult Bible Passages, Part 1. And we dug into Ezra chapter 9, Ezra chapter 10, and we looked up some things and we tried to come up with some answers, and I tried to equip people on how to handle a difficult Bible passage. Yesterday, here on the Theology Central podcast, we listened to the first episode of the Discover the Word podcast, where they were trying to figure out how do we read what we don't understand in the Old Testament and how do we understand Ezra chapter 10. Now, when we listened to their first episode, I threw in a couple of things, two things that I want to repeat and I want to remind you of. The first, and this is a very important concept, whenever sin occurs, whenever sin happens, we create a situation. We create a situation in which trying to figure out what to do after the sin has happened, where we try to figure out what to do now that this sin has occurred, it becomes almost impossible sometimes. Once sin occurs, it creates situations that are very difficult to resolve. It is very difficult to fix. Trying to find a solution at times can be impossible. And that is the first principle that I want you to take away from all of this discussion. Sin creates situations that are difficult to resolve. We just need to understand that. And Ezra chapter 10, their sin has created a situation that is very difficult to resolve, and it creates a difficult Bible passage to read. It sounds very unchristlike. It sounds cruel. It sounds crazy. But please remember, it was the sin that created the situation. Keep that in mind. Secondly, and this is very important, I've got to reach over. I've got to grab my Bible here. If you'll look in the book of Ezra, and I think this is very important, because this is a question that I did not address on Sunday, but I think it's important. In Ezra chapter 10, all right, after, there's this weeping, everyone's upset, and then Shechaniah, the son of Jehiel, He shows up and he's like, look, hey, y'all sinned, but there is hope in Israel concerning this thing. There is some hope. There is a solution. And in Ezra chapter 10, verse 3, this is what he says. Now, therefore, let us make a covenant with our God to put away all the wives and such as are born of them according to the counsel of my Lord and of those that tremble at the commandments of our God, and let it be done according to the law. So I raised a question yesterday. In Ezra chapter 10, verse 3, is Shechaniah making a statement, or is he making a statement that his solution came from God, or is he not bringing God into the situation? And it comes down to how you interpret verse 3. And here is the phrase, all right? I'm going to read it again. Now, therefore, let us make a covenant with our God to put away all the wives, and such are born of them, according to the counsel of my Lord. According to the counsel of my Lord. Some commentaries say, according to the counsel of my Lord, Shechaniah is saying, doing this, the counsel of my Lord is referring to Ezra. Ezra is upset about this. Ezra is confessing. He's weeping. He's tearing his clothes, plucking out his hair. He's upset. He knows something needs to be done. So Shechaniah is like, according to the counsel of my Lord, Ezra, this is what we should do because you know this has to be fixed. That Shechaniah is not saying he got the information from God. He got the instructions from God. That is how some commentaries interpret it. Others try to make an argument. No. The term Lord here is in many cases does refer to God. So he's saying that this is the instruction that came from God. There is some disagreement in how to interpret verse 3. So I challenged everyone to look up at least 5 commentaries to determine what you see, to determine how they approach it. And then from that, I wanted you to really think about which argument is the best. So those are the 2 views. And Ezra 10:3, yes, this putting away the wives solution came from God. Interpretation number 2 or option number 2, no. This solution did not come from God. It came from Shechaniah, and he's doing so because he believes this is what Ezra would want because he is so distraught, so upset. He thinks that this is the appropriate solution to the problem. So Ezra 10:3 is critical in trying to understand this difficult biblical passage. Now, yesterday on the Discover the Word program, they didn't address any of this. Of course, these programs are short. They're only 15 minutes long. And when you have their introduction and outro, there's not even 15 minutes of teaching. All they did yesterday was introduce the problem. Now we're going to listen to what they said today in the Discover the Word podcast. And we're going to analyze it and we're going to consider it. Based off their title for today's episode, they almost seem to imply that the solution was wrong. The marrying of the women was obviously wrong. They were not supposed to do this. They married pagan women, and clearly they were not supposed to do that. But the solution offered wasn't right either, that it was wrong as well. That seems to be what their title has implied. But I always do this. I don't listen to whenever I review something or share something, I try not to listen to it first because I want my reaction to be very real, not, rehearsed. So we're going to listen to this. They may make a great point here. They may make a questionable point, but you know what it hinges on. It hinges on Ezra chapter 10, verse 3. So that's why I gave you that work to do yesterday. All right. So let's listen to the Discover the Word podcast from today. Let's see what they do with Ezra chapter 10. Let's see if they give us some tools on how to handle difficult Bible passages. And then I'll come back and add my own thoughts to this. We're really trying to I'm trying to really put something together here that's going to be very beneficial for everyone. All right. So here we go. Let's listen carefully.
There are a number of factors that often make the Bible a challenging book to read and understand, like the fact that it was written thousands of years ago, was written in a culture and a time very different from ours. and the fact that we're reading translations because it wasn't written, of course, in English. Yeah, those are just a couple of the factors, and there are certainly more that make reading the Bible difficult. And this week on Discover the Word, we're talking about a section of the Old Testament that is a challenge, and that raises all sorts of questions. And the group is exploring together how to read a passage like that. Well, something that will help us when we're reading the Old Testament is next. And this is Discover the Word, the weekday small group Bible study from Our Daily Bread Ministries. We're ready for you to pull your chair up to the table with Mark D. Hahn and Elisa Morgan and Bill Crowder and Daniel Ryan Day, and continue our series of conversations this week called Reading the Old Testament. What the group is doing is giving you an example of how to work through one of those difficult passages in the Old Testament and what perspectives can help us in situations like this. Now, they are in Ezra chapters 10 and 11, and Bill is leading this week. And so today he's going to show us how keeping in mind the biblical concept of covenants will help us when we're reading the Old Testament, and especially passages like this one in Ezra.
An old word that we don't use a whole lot in our time, but it's not like it's completely foreign to us, is the word covenant. Okay, what do you hear when you hear that word?
I think of like a land covenant.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's that
So
mean?
an agreement between two parties.
Okay.
It's a sort of a formal, well, I guess it could be informal too, but it tends to be a formal agreement, doesn't it?
I actually think that something implicit in it is the concept of commitment. So yeah, an agreement.
Yeah.
There's a commitment
And
element.
sometimes it takes the form of a contract. And so you say a land covenant, I think in terms of a land contract,
Yeah.
which is probably the same thing, but just with a different name.
But we could also covenant between the two of us
That's right.
that we'll do something.
We're going to covenant together to play golf
There you
if
go.
summer ever would arrive in Michigan.
Now I have to jump in here because I'm somewhat interested here, maybe a little confused that their second broadcast this week, they're trying to figure out this whole Ezra 10 thing, and they're going to focus on the word covenant. They don't seem to be going to Ezra 10, in fact, Ezra 10:3. Let me read it again because I'm just going to keep coming back to this over and over and over again. Ezra 10:3. Now, therefore, let us make, now they do mention 3. Let us make a covenant with our God to put away all the wives and such as are born of them according to the counsel of my Lord. According to the counsel of my Lord, to me seems to be the issue. But they also have not gone back to chapter 9 because they just said that they're going to focus on chapter 10 and 11. I think chapter 9 is very important here. If you look at Ezra chapter 9, verse 2, when it describes the sin, for they have taken of their daughters for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy seed have mingled themselves with the people of those lands. That seems to describe the seriousness of the sin, is that you're going to mingle the seed so that the line of Israel would be all messed up. And that to me seems to be critical to understanding the text, because the line of Israel has to be kept somewhat, pure, because this is ultimately Christ will come from, the tribe of Judah. You've got to keep these lines pure. You got to know. And that's why when you get to the New Testament, the genealogies are so important to understanding who Jesus is. To prove who Jesus is, they have to look at genealogies. If the seed gets all mingled, the line gets all mingled, then these genealogies would not be able to work. That to me has to be considered. That means that the solution is going to have to be severe to try to protect what this sin was attempting to destroy. And so far, they haven't mentioned that. And so they're going to go to the word covenant. So I'm kind of interested and confused why it looks like Ezra 9:2 or Ezra 10:3, according to again. Let me read it again. I don't want to mispronounce it because we're dealing with a Bible difficulty. I got to make sure my words are precise. According to the counsel of my Lord. According to the counsel of my Lord seems to be the phrase that has to be looked at, but they're going to go focus on covenant. So Remember, they don't have a lot of time. So I'm very interested to see how they're going to do this. But let's go back and at least give them the opportunity to resolve this problem.
We do see that a lot with marriage, right? A covenant of marriage between two people.
Right. That wedding ceremonies sometimes are called, they're going to enter into the covenant of marriage. You see that on wedding invitations.
So there's an agreement, but you act it out. And that's what I'm thinking, the word commitment. You take it forward in action.
With that in mind, let's say that you signed a contract/covenant to work for a particular organization according to a specific set of expectations, guidelines, job description. And then the second week you're on the job, they come to you and tell you, we want you to do this set of job descriptions instead, and it's something you're totally not good at. Now, how do you feel?
I hear bait and switch.
Yeah.
Get them in the door and then switch what you have to do.
That sounds like a kind of an odd description, although I know people who've experienced that. A whole different set of expectations.
Is it a new owner?
Not necessarily. Sometimes it's just because the position is so fuzzy in the mind of the employer that as it takes more shape, it shifts into something the person doesn't feel qualified for or capable of. Now, I want you to keep that idea in mind with the word covenant. And when we normally use the word covenant, what are we referring to?
Abraham is the first example that comes to mind. God and Abraham making a promise.
And ultimately, the whole Old Testament or Old Covenant and New Testament, New Covenant.
There are a lot of covenants in the Bible where God makes an agreement with a person, like Abraham. I'm going to raise up from you a family that's going to bless the whole earth. David, your son is going to rule on your throne forever. And of course, that son would end up being Jesus. But there's also the big covenant that is the Old Covenant, the Mosaic covenant, because it was given by whom?
By God to Moses, Moses to the people.
To the people.
Yeah.
What I would like for us to think about today is when we start reading difficult texts in the Old Testament, a starting place on how we try to figure out what to do with that is remembering which covenant we're under. Because sometimes we're like the employee who we've entered into an agreement, but then somebody changes all the rules and tries to put us under a different agreement. You see where I'm going with that?
No, I don't see quite the connection. Could you explain a little more?
What I mean by that is this. There is thinking within Christian circles today that tries to impose on people who are under a covenant of grace the rules of the covenant of law. And that's not our covenant.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're under a different covenant.
We do that to ourselves.
We do that to ourselves. And so we'll co-opt something out of the Old Testament. And so you got to do this.
So the job description connection is that we've been given this job description in the new covenant.
Right.
But sometimes it feels like people try to grab the old covenant and say, oh, no, you need to do this instead. And we go, whoa, that wasn't part of the agreement.
It's so hard not to do it because we go back and forth between the Old and New Testaments.
Okay, now I'm getting a little bit more confused by the second. It sounds like the path they're taking is this. Hey, this is in the Old Covenant, has nothing to do with us. We're under the New Covenant. So this is just how it worked in the Old Covenant. That still doesn't really answer, well, wait a minute. So you're saying under the Old Covenant, they didn't value marriage? Under the Old Covenant, they didn't value the family unit? And so God just came in and destroyed it? Is that a good enough? That's almost not an answer. That's almost a way to avoid it. Hey, when you come to a difficult passage of Scripture, if it's in the Old Covenant, just remember we're under the New Covenant. It doesn't apply to us. Whoa, slow down. Well, first of all, let's remember, we are definitely Old Covenant, New Covenant. Not making I'm not arguing against that, but let's remember all Scripture is inspired of God and it is profitable. So there's still got to be something we can learn from it. And I do agree that sometimes we have to take that approach. Hey, this is how it worked in the Old Covenant. It's not how it worked in the New Covenant. But we can't just use that to avoid the difficult question. In the Old Covenant, God called everyone in and basically told them to commit genocide and wipe everyone off the face of the earth. Okay, well, that was the Old Covenant. We don't have to worry about it because we're not told to do that in the New. That still doesn't answer the question of why God would have the people commit genocide. You see, it just avoids the difficulty. It doesn't really face the difficulty. Now, that is an important part of the discussion. That is an important part of building an interpretation, because now we're going to get into what is applicable to us and which is not applicable. But I guarantee you, here's what Christians do. Hey, this part in the Old Testament, it's difficult and I don't like it. Hey, that's the Old Covenant. It doesn't apply to me. And then they'll go to Jeremiah. Hey, I know the plans I have for you, to bless you, to prosper you. Oh, that's for us. Wait a minute. Isn't that in the Old Testament? So sometimes we play loose games with what we say is applicable to us and what isn't applicable to us. And sometimes just using the Old Covenant, New Covenant, distinction doesn't always work there. So I'm a little concerned that they're just going to try to avoid the problem. Hey, it's in the Old Covenant, but I could be wrong. They may be going to set this up to really dig in, but they only have, let me look at my clock here. They only have 8 minutes and 44 seconds left. So we'll have to see, but let's listen and see what they have to say.
Yeah. And at that point, that's why, as we think about these issues, it gets really fuzzy. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the fact of the matter is, we're looking at a very difficult text this week. Mm-hmm. And we are looking at a text where something really bad happens to our ears. Mm-hmm. What text are we looking at?
We're in Ezra, chapter 10, and it's a really uncomfortable text.
Yeah. Would you mind just reading the uncomfortable part starting in verse 2, Elisa?
Sure. And they have intermarried. And in verse 2, Shechaniah, son of Jehiel, one of the descendants of Elam, said to Ezra, this is in a public gathering, "We've been unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women from the peoples around us. But in spite of this, there's still hope for Israel. Now let us make a covenant before our God to send away all these women and their children in accordance with the counsel of my Lord and of..."
Lowercase l, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Referring to Ezra.
Yeah. "And of those who fear the commands of our God. Let it be done according to the law."
Yeah. That last phrase is so important.
Mm-hmm. And the law is capitalized.
That's right. They're trying to figure out, how do we live under the covenant that our people have made with God and that we have violated?
At Sinai of Moses, right?
That's right. They came under Moses' law at Sinai. And part of that law, and the part that's critical to this conversation, is in Exodus 34, verse 14 through 16. So, Daniel, would you read that for us?
"For you shall not worship any other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Otherwise you might make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they would play the harlot with their gods and sacrifice to their gods. And someone might invite you to eat of his sacrifice, and you might take some of his daughters for your sons, and his daughters might play the harlot with their gods, and cause your sons also to play the harlot with their gods."
Okay, this is a command against intermarriage.
With people of other religions, of other gods.
People of the land. And the reason this becomes really an important distinction is because this is not an ethnic issue. I remember times in our culture here in the U.S. when there were all kinds of taboos about interracial marriage and things like this, and we need to put right on the front, this is not that. This is a totally spiritual thing. All those tribes of the land were ultimately Semitic in background. They had all come from Shem, one of the sons of Noah. What the difference is the worship and the gods. And what God is doing with this command against intermarriage is he's trying to protect them against idolatry that could come into them through this process of intermarriage. Now, we're hundreds of years later, these guys have intermarried. And they rightly admit, we've been unfaithful to our God. We've broken our covenant with God. What are we going to do about it? And they come up with what to 21st century eyes seems like the absolute worst solution you could ever come up with.
Mm-hmm. It does seem to be them that comes up with it. Mm-hmm. Like, we don't see God saying this. This is an idea that Shechaniah, son of Jehiel, a son of Elam, has.
Mm-hmm. They give him.
All right, now, this is very important for you to understand. The word Lord, it is in lowercase in Ezra 10. That is a very good point. And I'm glad they point that out. But the Hebrew word used there All right. The Hebrew word used there is this. See if it sounds familiar to you.
Strong's H136. Adonai. Adonai.
It's Adonai. Now, Adonai can be used of men, and Adonai can be used of God. All right. Lord, it's a title spoken in place of Yahweh and Jewish display of reverence. So it is Adonai. It is translated 400. It's used 434 times in the King James. It's translated Lord with a capital L 431 times. It's translated Lord with a lowercase l 2 times, and it's used in Ezra. It's used, well, I'd have to go through all of these. They pulled up Ezra 10. It pulled up Ezra 10. So it's used twice. I'd have to see where the second reference is. I'd have to look for it. But so the argument is, hey, it's lowercase, therefore we know that's not God. This is referring to Ezra, which is a possible interpretation of it. But remember, it's the Hebrew word Adonai, which is used of God 400. It's used with a capital L 434 times. It's used of God most of the time. It's referring to God. So, okay, why does it have a lowercase l? Now, this becomes very important. Is a lowercase l there because of a translation committee making the determination? Or if we were to go to the manuscripts, would the manuscript have a lowercase l or whatever the Hebrew letter would be? Those are important questions to consider. Now, I agree. If we can say that Shechaniah came up with this is his plan, had nothing to do with God, then that resolves part of the difficulty here. And then what we could say is, hey, this is just the Bible describing what happened. It's not saying that it was good or saying that it was right. Now, that we would have to read the rest of the text to see, does God show agreement with what they do, or does he show disagreement with what they did? That would be something we would have to look at as well. But just that Lord thing, they went past that really quick. Hey, it's lowercase l. It's referring to Ezra. Not all commentaries agree with that, and you do need to tell the people that is the Hebrew word Adonai, okay? You need to let them know that is the Hebrew word Adonai, which is typically used to refer to God. It can be used to refer to men. It can be. But I think its primary use is to refer to God, all right? So just, they didn't give you that information, and I think that is critical in trying to deal with with a difficult passage. All right, let's let them finish.
The benefit of the doubt, he was trying to be true to the God who gave them the law.
Who in Exodus really does hang this disobedience, at least the responsibility and the consequences for it, on daughters and children. It's very unsettling. And I'm going back to, yes, this is inspired by God. How could it be profitable? But I'm like, why is it inspired? How in the world could this be something he wants us to have?
Yeah, and I think the question you just raised, Elisa, is a question that people wrestle with very deeply.
Yeah. At the same time, we have to, I think, feel something of what Shechaniah, their people have just gone into exile, into Babylon. They've lost their temple. They've lost their sovereignty, independence as a nation, because they have been unfaithful to the law of God. Yeah. So it's kind of like they say, we can't do this over again. We have to make this right. Right?
But they can't, and none of us can. And there's this.
But how are they to know that? You know?
Yeah. Again, remember, under the law, it was very black and white. You were either obedient or disobedient. So how do you fix disobedient? Well, you're right, you can't. But our tendency is to try.
Yeah. To me, this almost sounds like when I try to fix a problem and end up making it worse. And maybe that's not what happens in this situation, and I guess we'll find out as we go. But this just has that anthem to it, like in my life when I cause a problem and then I end up making it worse by trying to fix it.
And maybe that is part of what is profitable for us, is to understand our inability
human nature.
Correct things.
We can take that and even expand it further. In Acts chapter 7, Stephen is preaching just before they stone him to death for what he's preaching. And as he's preaching, he's talking to them, the people of Israel, and he's saying, you who received the law as ordained by angels and yet did not keep it. They were given a law, that they couldn't keep.
There was a severity to it, and God often did require terrible things to be done to unfaithful women or men or children. You can understand why Shechaniah and these people, why he was trying to do a hard thing.
Yeah.
Because that's what the law demanded.
Yeah. And I think for us, we can first start and pause and say, thankfully, we live after the cross and the resurrection. And so we're under a different covenant. So we do not have to say, well, how am I supposed to apply this in my life? Maybe the takeaway is we're under grace. We're on this side of the cross and the empty tomb. And that changes everything about how we read the Bible and everything about how we live.
Yeah, the Old Testament law was certainly hard to keep. In fact, it couldn't be kept. And it showed us that we could never live up to God's perfect standard on our own. And so I, for one, certainly echo Bill's sentiment that I'm glad I don't have to apply this in my life in this way today. And I'm also grateful to God for establishing the new covenant of grace in which we live under now. Well, this is Discover the Word with Mart D. Hahn, Elisa Morgan, Bill Crowder, and Daniel Ryan Day. The daily Bible study brought to you by Our Daily Bread Ministries. And our series this week is titled Reading the Old Testament. And Discover the Word is rather unique in that it's not a preaching program like many others that you hear. And although we respect and we listen to and we have learned a lot from those Bible teachers, we think there's something valuable about sitting around a table and exploring the Scriptures together with friends in community like this. And when you give to support this ministry, you are making it possible for people all around the world to discover the life-changing wisdom of the Bible with us. You can support the ministry by giving online at discovertheword.org. And when you're there, don't forget to check out the new featured resource, a book from Dr. Paul Brand and Philip Yancey titled Fearfully and Wonderfully, The Marvel of Bearing God's Image. Now, I think you'd agree that the human body is filled with endlessly fascinating secrets. And you don't have to be a scientist or a doctor to be amazed by God's intricate creation of the human body. Well, Philip Yancey will be with us here on Discover the Word next week to talk about this. And so look for his book, Fearfully and Wonderfully, when you visit our website at discovertheword.org. All right, well, when reading passages like Ezra chapter 10, it's important to ask ourselves, is this story purely informational? Is it descriptive? Or is this teaching me how I should live? Is it prescriptive? Well, next time, Mart, Elisa, Bill, and Daniel will consider that important distinction in the context of the Israelites' decision to break apart their families. I'm Brian Hedinga, hoping to see you again Wednesday right here on Discover the Word. Discover the Word is provided by Our Daily Bread Ministries.
And there you have their episode. Now, their episode's very frustrating. And it's very frustrating for this. They fly right past the whole use of Lord there. They don't consider any commentaries. They don't look it up. They do not tell you that that's the Hebrew word Adonai. They don't tell you that that's usually used to refer to God. They don't tell you that that's used lowercase 2 times, Ezra 10:3. I believe I found the second use of the lowercase. It's Isaiah 21:8, where we read, "And he cried, a lion, my Lord, I stand continually upon the watchtower in the daytime, and I am set in my ward whole nights." And my ward whole nights. All right. Yeah, that's not super helpful, because we'd have to figure out exactly which Lord who is he speaking of there. I do want to do something though really quick. I just thought about this, and we're working through this together, and that's the thing about doing it this way is that's the way it works. So let's do this. I'm going to look at how all the different translations translate this. The New International Version. Now let us make a covenant. This is Ezra 10:3. Now let us make a covenant before our God to send away all the women and their children in accordance with the counsel of my Lord, lowercase. Now the New Living Translation, they definitely They definitely have a certain take on this. Let us now make a covenant with our God to divorce our pagan wives and to send them away with their children. We will follow the advice given by you and by the others who respect the commandments of our God. All right, they clearly have that coming from Ezra. I think that's very important. The others use the term Lord, lowercase, Lord, New American, lowercase, New King James. The New King James, according to the advice of my master. So they remove the word Lord, but no matter what word they put there, it's still the Hebrew word Adonai. If we follow your advice. So it's interesting. We have some want to remove the word Lord completely. Some want to keep the word Lord there. But again, the lowercase L, I think it is a good argument. But my concern is that a decision made by the translators, or is there something in the original where, okay, they didn't use a capital, or is the translator reading the text and inferring, okay, he's not saying he got that information from God, he got that from Ezra, and so let's throw a lowercase L on it. That is where I would have to really dig into some commentaries to see what they have to say, and then how are capital letters used in the Hebrew text. I'm not an expert in the Hebrew text to know, or Hebrew manuscripts, but those are questions that have to be asked. And they didn't really answer that. They just made a pretty clear assumption. It's Ezra. Boom. Therefore, this is not coming from God. This is a decision they made. They made it because they're under the old covenant and everything is black and white. Aren't we glad we're under the new covenant where, we have grace and, where if we mess up, we'll be forgiven. Now, we got to remember, even under the new covenant, we're still called to obedience. We're still called to holiness. We're still called to obey God. And we still have to figure out what to do when we disobey God. We can't just say, well, we're under the new covenant. I'm under grace. I don't have to worry about it. I messed up. Now I don't have to worry about what to do. No, we still have to figure out how to resolve difficult situations that arise from our sin. So they focused on the word covenant, but to me, what they really needed to do more work on is Ezra 10:3 to really dig into that, because that's really what the argument hinges on. Who's giving the solution? Was it Ezra? Shechaniah doing so on behalf of Ezra? Did they come up with the solution? And now, this is what I'm going to ask you to do in this one, because I like to give you your own homework. This is what I want you to do. Let's go with their solution. This is not God giving the solution. This is not God telling them what to do. They came up with this idea to put away the wives. Now, read Ezra 10:4 and following. Go all the way to the end of the chapter. Is there anything in the chapter that seems to indicate God approves of what they did? All right? Because if there's something that seems to indicate God approves of it, this is very important, that God approves of it, well, then that would put you right back into the same problem. And wait a minute, now I'm confused. Hang on. Yeah, for some reason they said Ezra chapter 10 chapter 10 and 11, and all of a sudden it just hit me. There is no Ezra chapter 11, so I don't know what they're referring to. I don't know what they're referring to. There's only Ezra chapter 10. Maybe I misheard them, but I think they said Ezra chapter 10 and 11. There is no chapter 11. Okay, so Ezra chapter 10. So read the rest of Ezra chapter 10. Is there anything in the text that seems to indicate God is approving of this? God agrees with this, or is it simply describing what they did? There was sin, and this is the solution they came up with. And then we can sit back and go, the solution was right or the solution was wrong. All right. Now, and again, we're going to go along with their argument. Lowercase L, this is Ezra. They were doing something in accordance with Ezra's desire. They were doing something in accordance, they came up with the plan. They came up with the plan. They were going to listen to themselves and to the other people who feared God. This was purely the people coming up with the idea. Now, read the rest of the book of Ezra. And this is just important to consider. And the rest of the book of Ezra, do we have anything where God is speaking to the people either through a prophet or speaking directly to the people, where they say, this is what God said? If that's common in the book of Ezra, then all of a sudden, when we get to chapter 10, God no longer speaks to them. They no longer seek God for an answer. So in chapter 1 through 9, do we have, thus saith the Lord, thus saith the Lord, God speaking, God speaking, God speaking. And all of a sudden in chapter 10, when they're facing a national crisis, right? All of a sudden God doesn't speak, and they come up with a plan. That would be a dramatic change in the narrative, would it not? Now, if all through the book of Ezra, God is not seen to be speaking to them, all right, other than them referring to maybe an Old Testament passage of Scripture, then then you would have a good argument. Well, then in chapter 10, why would God be speaking here? He hasn't spoken in the entire book. All right? I think that's very important. In fact, I'm just going to look really quick here. Okay, it doesn't start the typical way. Captives return. That it could be interesting. Yeah. A lot of times in the Old Testament books, thus the word of the Lord came unto the prophet. The word of the Lord came unto. It would be interesting to go through chapters 1 through 9 and see, do we have anything there where it's like God spoke to them? If we don't at all, then I think we're on to something in chapter 10. Lowercase L, that's not, even though it's using the Hebrew word Adonai, it can be used to refer to men. Ezra, Shechaniah, they come up with a plan. They came up with a plan. They listened to other people who feared God, and this is the plan they came up with. And it just describes what they did. And we have to assign whether it was good, whether it was right. Was it right under the old covenant, but would be wrong under the new covenant? Or was it just wrong, period? All right. And again, if it was wrong, period, this is what happens. That the message that we're really going to get from this is when we sin, we have to ensure that, and I'll leave with this principle. Whenever we sin, it creates situations that are difficult to fix. That is true, but this is another important principle. When we sin, we can't commit another sin in order to try to fix the first sin, all right? That is something we have to avoid. Whenever we sin, we can't commit another sin and trying to deal with the first sin, and we probably all have been guilty of doing that. I think that's something else to consider as well. So, Go from Ezra chapter 1 to Ezra chapter 9. See if there are passages where it says, thus saith the Lord. God is speaking to them, speaking to Ezra. And if that's common, then when we get to chapter 10, and all of a sudden, wait, God's not giving them the instruction here, they're coming up with this. Well, that would be an interesting way of reading it, or it would demonstrate that they didn't even bother to seek God, which would really show that their whole confession is really messed up. In fact, we would really probably view chapter 10 in a very negative light. Right? Not seeing this wonderful repentance and confession, we would see them, well, we messed up. Now we're going to fix it. And we're not even going to, go to God to find out what he has to say. But if God is not speaking anywhere in the book, well, then they would be operating under the same situation we are, that they would have whatever scripture they had available to them, whatever law they had available to them, and they would have to come up with a solution based on the written revelation that they had, because God wasn't giving them any other information. So then it would make sense for them to possibly come up with a crazy idea. Right? I think we have to consider 1 through 9. So read that. Let me know what you discover. And again, make sure we understand the word Lord in Ezra 10:3. Yes, it's a lowercase l. It is the Hebrew word Adonai. It's used over 400 times in the Old Testament. It typically is used to refer to God, right? However, there are two occasions where it does not use a capital L, it uses a lowercase l. I do not know if that's because the translators are trying to interpret it or if that's the way it would be in the Hebrew manuscripts. we would have to find that information. But just make sure you have a correct understanding of exactly what is going on there, because they went past that really fast. And I think that can be misleading to a lot of people, all right? Because at some point, they didn't even tell you what the Hebrew word was, which I think was interesting, because they know as soon as they said that's Adonai, there would be 1 million people going, wait, I've heard 900 sermons about the name Adonai. What? That has to be God, okay? So you have to really consider that. All right, I'll stop right there. If you have any questions, thoughts, or comments, email me at newsif@yahoo.com, newsif@yahoo.com. If you're listening to me live, great. If you're not, you may never hear this. At the beginning, my dog started barking and there was all kinds of noise going on in the other part of the house. And so it kind of messed up this recording, and I was trying to hurry a little bit and getting all worried about the sound. So I was a little distracted. So I'm going to go back and listen to it. If I don't like it, I will delete this and we'll have to reaccomplish this later tonight. But if you are listening to me live, you can tell me what you think about how this came out by emailing me really quick at newsif@yahoo.com to tell me whether to keep it or delete it. All right. I'll stop right there. Thank you for listening. And we're going to continue this week listening to the Discover the Word program, see where else they go with this. And, we've got something else to work on. The whole book of Ezra. We've got 9 chapters to look through and see what we find. I think that is important to, when trying to deal with difficulties, don't look for simple answers. Look for an in-depth study to give you whatever answer you may end up with, whether it's simple or not. I think that's important. All right, I'll stop right there. Everyone have a great day. God bless.